Welcome to the presentation. My name is Ken Oldenburger. I'm a consultant who's been in the business now for getting close to 30 years. I've done pretty much everything that there is to do in records management consulting except for implementing EDRMSs, ECMs, that sort of thing. Most of my work has been with provincial governments, municipal governments, territorial governments, regional districts, but also work with societies, First Nations, universities, and private corporations. The aspects that I'm kind of focused on is records classification design. Been doing that pretty much for the full 30 years. And also in the last 15 years, I've really focused a lot on doing assessments. So this is essentially what this presentation is going to be touching on is assessing records management programs and then developing strategic plans out of that. So what we're going to see here is a case study that is based on a reassessment of an organization. So the organization I'm talking about, City of Nanaimo. Welcome, and let's get started. All right, so for an agenda, what we're going to look at very quickly is the 2017 assessment. That's when Nanaimo first called me in, and I did a full and complete assessment. And then there were some years in between. We can talk a little bit about them. And then I was called back for the 2023 assessment. And so I really want to do a comparison of the 2017 assessment versus the 2023 assessment. And from that comparison, kind of really put my finger on which projects strategically give your records management program its biggest bang for the buck. The City of Nanaimo, we're talking about 40 departments or offices. Some of them we were able to combine into one visit, one interview process. I'll go through the methodology in a second. But real quickly about the City of Nanaimo, it's on the east coast of Vancouver Island. Beautiful city, about 100,000 people. The city's got about 700 full-time employees. And most of those are what I would call knowledge workers or information workers. So they're touching records, moving records, creating records, that sort of thing. All right. The methodology. All right. So when I was called in 2017, this is the process that I adopted. And this is a pretty typical process for me to do a records management program assessment. So I start by reviewing RIM documentation, so your bylaws, policies, classification system, your retention schedules, training, all that sort of stuff. But also documentation that impacts information and records, so your freedom of information, information security, backup processes. Sometimes in human resources, you've got some things that have, confidentiality issues, things like that. And then I review corporate documents because I want to see how much weight your records management program actually has been given in the organization at the highest levels. So the strategic plan, the budget, of course the org chart so I can figure out what's going on, that kind of thing. The next step is an in-depth interview with the records management team, and that's really where I get probably at least 50 to 60% of my direct information when I do these assessments. I also meet with the senior management team. This is really important because it helps me to understand the accountability of the organization. So an awareness of where records management program is for the organization. Then I would go in and interview each business unit. I do this with the records team with me because they'll ask you questions that are not relevant to a consultant. Things like, do you know when we're going to get such and such software installed in our office? That sort of thing. And that's when the records team fields those questions. And then I go and examine all the electronic and physical file repositories, active and inactive. All right, once all that's done, I take all the data, all the observations and the measurements, and I go back and I crunch them, and I do a draft assessment. The assessment, it's very important. When I use the word assessment, I'm talking at the high level, not at the high level, at the low level, at the granular level. looking at how things add up against the principles, so the generally accepted record keeping principles. I really hope everybody knows what they are. We'll see them worded out in a minute because we're going to be looking at the measurements quite well. I also identify observations that I make, propose strategic plan projects to build your process, and I usually identify some risks that your unique organization may be facing. All right. So, in the 2017 assessment, these were the metrics that I discovered. So, if you're in the yellow, those are pretty good. For a beginning assessment of a records management program, being in the twos, even the low twos, is not terrible. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen. The red ones, however, are disconcerting. So we'll get into that as well. So I wanted to look at protection and availability. So 2.2 and 2.0, why are they slightly into the higher areas? I discovered very quickly that this is because the IT department and the records and information management team were working their butts off to react to the needs of the organization. So protection, of course, protecting the electronic records, and availability, making sure that people had access to the information that they needed. Now, these are not great numbers. Anybody who's worked with the IG principles knows that you want to have a number between 3.0 and 3.5. That's a really healthy state to be in. 3.0 to 3.5 is kind of the target that I would aim for the organizations that I work with. If you're working with organizations like police stations, like oil and gas, pharmacy, other law enforcement like intelligence gathering, you may want to be higher. You may want to be in the 4s. But for most organizations, a 3.0 to a 3.5 is fine. The 1.3 and the 1.4 that we see here for compliance and retention, these are not fine. These are bad. Anything that's in the low ones, these are things that you really need to address and quickly, because there's risk associated with these things. The reason why these two, compliance and retention, were so low is because they had some very bad document management practices. I won't go into the details of those practices, but they were bad. Also, they didn't have any policies and procedures, and the classification system that they were trying to use, frankly, it was busted and had to go. So that's why those were so low. Then accountability. I love this number. This is an interesting one. As a consultant, when I do a full and formal assessment like I did here, if I see accountability in the low 2s, that's actually a really good sign. The reason why it's a good sign is because at the low 2s, it means that there's both a cultural awareness and an executive awareness. So it's not just the people on the ground that know that records management is poor. The actual managers and executive director, CAO, whatever, they're also aware that it's a poor situation. If it's in the if it's in the ones, what I have found out often is that typically says that there's been one individual who's championing a good records and information management program, and that means that if that person leaves, changes jobs, gets hit by a lottery, whatever, it's at risk of completely stalling the entire records management program. And I've seen that too many times. So if I see a 1.8 in accountability, I start going, oh, this does not look good. This does not look good. I've had multiple assessments that were in the high ones that were dependent on one individual, possibly two, and when they left, the whole thing ground to a halt. So I really love to see a 2.2, 2.3 when I do my first assessment. All right. So that was 2017, and those are the measurements. What happened in between? Well, the records management team was assembled. They had a records management team. So things were going great that way. And they got started right away on some of these records management projects that I had suggested out of the strategic plan. So things were moving. Then COVID hit. So they do have a very good excuse for not being able to get as many of these strategic plan projects finished as they would have liked to. All right. But they did get some done. They had progress. They had good progress, actually, given COVID. So in 2023, they called me up and they said, we want to do an assessment. Okay. So I said, at first they just wanted to do the offices that were implemented because most of the offices have not been implemented. So they wanted to focus on the implemented offices. And I said, if you want to do an apples to apples comparison, we should do the whole organization. So fortunately, they bit the bullet and said, okay, we'll do the whole organization. So I did almost the exact same methodology as the 2017 assessment, except I had fewer interview questions because I was able to winnow down a lot of information. And rather than last time where I tracked things at a corporate level for those measurements, I tracked those metrics for each and every office, which was a little bit more laborious, but honestly, it gave some very interesting results. So that's some of the stuff that we're going to look at today. All right, so this is the numbers that I found for the 2023 assessment. If we take a look at this, you see the column on the left. This is the metric that I found for all the offices. So this would be comparing apples to apples with the 2017 results. The middle one is looking just at those offices which the records and information management team managed to go into and actually do implementation. So implementation was, here's the classification system, here we have policies and procedures. They gave some one-on-one time, they chatted with them, got some records management, got the classification system actually implemented on the shared drives and things like this. So some actual implementation of the records management program in these offices. The third column is the difference between all of the offices and just the implemented offices. So you can see right off the bat, integrity and retention went up quite a bit. So this was exciting. Really interesting to see this kind of dynamic. But I'm not going to read too much into this at this point, but we are going to go along and see a couple more interesting things. All right. Why is my slide not moving? All right, so what we're seeing here is the apples to apples comparison between the 2017 measurements of the principals and the 2023 all offices measurements. All right, so the red ones, we didn't see a whole lot of change. Honestly, not a whole lot of change. Why did they not really change very much? Well, keep in mind that protection and availability, the ones that didn't change pretty much at all, they were already pretty much high. They were already at the 2.2 and the 2.0. So they were already doing a lot of work in order to maintain that level of protection and that level of availability. What had changed is that they were not working their butts off as much. So it's kind of like a hidden benefit that we're seeing on those two. Accountability as well was already reasonably well situated. And disposition, they haven't done any disposition. So they're not at a robust state yet where they can start going through and start destroying things properly and correctly. So the disposition is still lagging behind. That's not an unreasonable thing. The two that really went well were transparency and compliance. Why? First of all, they had things to actually show people. They had policies and procedures. They had a records classification system. So they had things to actually show, so they could be transparent. And there's some other stuff that's going to be very interesting about this transparency and compliance later on. Compliance, of course, if you have nothing to comply against, your compliance is difficult to achieve. Plus, they had those bad practices that I mentioned. They stopped those from happening almost completely. So some bad practices were almost completely eliminated, which made a huge benefit to their compliance principle. All right. So let's look at apples to very, very nice apples. The 2017 principles measurements versus the 2023 implemented offices measurements. Look at this. Huge increases in integrity, in compliance, and in retention. So the introduction of the records management program to these offices resulted in far better records management practices. Makes only sense, right? But then again, we see protection and availability have only increased a little bit. That's still a little bit of a leftover of how much work IT and records management were putting in to protect records and make records available. So I'm harping on about this, but that is actually what happened with those numbers not moving very much. But all of the numbers went up. And I mean, we could look at transparency as well and see that it's gone up quite a bit as well. Part of the reason why disposition went up as well is because there were some improper disposition practices. Not because we are now destroying things properly, but because previously we were destroying things that shouldn't have been destroyed. So disposition got a bump there too. All right. Let's look at the meat of the matter. So we've talked about the measurements. Which projects, so when I say projects, I'm talking about the strategic projects that were recommended in the 2017 assessment and strategic plan. I had a list of projects, and these are some of them. So the projects that they completed from the 2017 strategic plan, first of all, records and information management policies and procedures. This is very, very important. And I have to say, this area of records management program is often neglected, or it's kind of half-assed. Like either you got one giant records management policy that kind of has some motherhood and apple pie sort of statements, but doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty of things. You need to have good records management policies and procedures. You need specifics. You need to explain why policies are useful, both for the employees and for the organization. These foundational documents are vital for every single generally accepted record-keeping principle, but especially for the strategic ones, for accountability, for transparency, for compliance, because policies and procedures touch everything in records management. So, as far as I'm concerned, records management policies and procedures, assuming you're actually going to use them, they are a huge bang for your buck because they are not expensive, they shouldn't be expensive, and they are vital for your records management program. So I think those are huge bang for your buck. Just very quickly, a couple areas that I often see ignored or neglected are legal holds and define your transitory records, people. My goodness. All right. The second one there, records classification and retention schedule. It is super important to have this. Obviously, a records management program can't exist without it, but it doesn't have a big impact on the principals or the organization, of course, until it is implemented. So it needs to be rolled out. It needs to be on the active paper files and on the active shared drives and on the active SharePoint sites, all that sort of thing. It needs to be integrated into the lives of your offices. And that's where we saw a lot of impact on your implemented offices, was having these classification system implemented. The main principles that it impacts are availability, retention, disposition, but of course transparency and compliance, because of course it's transparent, they can know where it is, they can see it and read it, and it's something that they need to be compliant with. Again, this is a big bang for your buck if you have a good classification system. A poor subject-based classification system, or how should I put it, a partially functional classification system will be a drag on your entire records management program. So it will be a frustration throughout if you don't have a nice, clean, simple one. But of course it's vital, so you have to do it. Now, ECM, Enterprise Content Management, or an EDRMS, IT tends to call these things Enterprise Content Management Systems, and records managers tend to call them Electronic Document and Records Management Systems, EDRMSs. How much of a big bang for the buck? Hang on. This one's similar to the classification system. It has no impact on the principals or the organization until it's implemented. So it's got to be installed and implemented in each office. A lot of work, expensive. Now, I want to say, hear me carefully, this is a huge buck for a huge bang. You all know how expensive these are to purchase, to implement, and to maintain. And to make the most of them, please plan the installation and the implementation well. Take advantage of their features, like workflow processing, digital signatures, all this sort of thing. Do your planning first, then do the implementation. Please do that properly, and you'll have a good, well-running system. Very expensive, but very powerful if you can afford it. The previous slide were the projects that were completed to a degree. Of course, I'm not talking about implementation yet, but the policies were finished, the design of the classification was finished, and the selection of an ECM was finished. Now, we have another number of projects that the records management team were trying to get finished before COVID smacked them in the head. So we can't really blame them for that, but let's take a look at these other projects. So again, these are projects from the strategic plan, and they'd completed a few of them. These are ones that are in progress. So, implementation. Again, COVID really took the wind out of the sails for what has, even in the best of times, implementation is a frustratingly slow process. The Nanaimo team has been working hard, and at the time of this filming, they are working hard and trying to get more and more offices implemented. But an implementation of the classification system and implementation of the EDRMS benefits all of the principals. That's what we're talking about here with implementation. This project isn't one that I can say really gives you bang for your buck, because with the current approaches to implementation, it is slow, it is expensive, it is labor intensive, but it's crucial. You can't do it. It is the records management program. Now, interestingly, I'm not going to get into it here, but we are starting to see implementation being tackled by artificial intelligence and auto classification. And so this is a discussion that you need to have, and I suggest that you have a chat with Rick Sterling over at Western IM, and maybe have a chat about possible options for dealing with slow implementations. The other thing that they've been working on is the records management training. Training is always an Achilles heel. This hurts many records management programs, partly because often information workers are not trained. But you need to train your information workers. I mean, you don't need to train them how to read a classification system, but you need to train them on some of the basics, like what is a transitory record? What is your responsibility around information security? These kinds of things. It's very important. And it shouldn't take very long. Hopefully, I'm preaching to the choir here. Yeah. So once you get your basic training of information users, you need more advanced training, of course, for people who are actually dealing with records management. So those are the people that need to know how to read a classification system. They need to know how to go find where the policies are, that sort of thing. That's the important step. If you do records management training, you should see an immediate increase in compliance and transparency, because people are now aware. They should be more compliant. The transparency is there as well. Now, at the City of Nanaimo, there has been some change management training happening. And while it isn't exactly records and information management training, it is very important, and the team in Nanaimo came up with some very clever and modern approaches. Basically, they're doing what I'm doing right now. So I've adopted their approach by filming, videotaping this so that it's available and repeatable. So I'm going to be having this on my YouTube channel for people to look at and review whenever they want to. So having a relatively short video, not as long as this presentation, but short videos, well scripted and acted out, can really give a lot of punch. And that's exactly what the records and information management team at Nanaimo did. So, for example, they used this process to introduce the new EDRMS that they purchased, with very funny sort of referring to it as laserfish instead of laserfish. So you got a bit of a hook, no pun intended. And it's a really useful way to introduce a concept to the organization in a palatable way and in a quick way. So they used an external platform to track who has actually taken the training. And in the future, all of the training, records management training, FOI training, that sort of thing, is going to use this approach. And I am embracing this myself. There are methods of not just tracking, but also even quizzing people who take these videos. All right. The third one here, well, going back to the records management training real quickly, having videos is a far, far better approach than gathering a bunch of people together in a hot, sweaty room for an hour so that a Ken Oldenburger can talk at them and put papers in front of their face. A video is far, far better. So pursue that concept and we'll see how things go. Get back to me if you have questions. All right. The third one there, records and information management manual. All right, I'm going to read this. Creating and updating a RIM manual was one of the projects that I recommended in the 2017 strategic plan, of course. In case you haven't heard of such a thing, a RIM manual basically includes all of the corporate level records management documents, such as in Nanaimo's case, they had a RIM bylaw. We have the RIM policies and procedures. We have the classification system and retention schedule. We have forms and instructions on how to fill out the forms and instructions on how to do things. We have naming conventions, training documents, or in this case, video recordings. Hint. Contact information. So if you want to contact an FOI person or you want to contact a records management person, that stuff is in the RIM manual. And you can even have department-specific RIM documents. So, for example, if you need a workflow laid out on how to handle invoice processing or an application for a permit or something like this, having those steps laid out in documentation is very helpful. So this RIM manual is a living and growing set of documents because things change. things change. Your policies and procedures can change. We have a new electronic documents as electronic records as documentary evidence has been updated in 2024. So the policies need to be updated. The classification system should be changing all the time. When you have legal citations that change, they need to change the classification system. So it's a living document, this RIM manual. So here's the one where the City of Nanaimo records management team blew my mind. I've always advocated for using a website to organize and publish a kind of an intranet specifically for records management in the organization. They took it a step further. They developed a user-friendly SharePoint communication site. Now, I'm not a fan of SharePoint for records management, but it is excellent for this kind of use. So their communication sites are very good. The records management team put a lot of work into it. They organized it, and wow, did they get a big bang for their buck. The result is a virtual and very principle-friendly method of collecting and presenting their RIM manual. So transparency, compliance, accountability, all of these things are bolstered by having the RIM manual easily available. Super, super important. And since this approach costs almost nothing to develop and to maintain, it is an enormous bang for your buck. As I went through the interviews in 2023 with the various departments and offices, every single office knew of the existence of this RIM communication site. Not everybody knew what was on it, but that doesn't matter. They knew that it was there, and they knew that that's where they would go if they had specific questions or if they need to contact somebody or things like that. Absolutely brilliant. This was a game changer, really. Now, before we look at some screenshots of that RIM manual, I'll just say that a well-organized and accessible manual really boosts your three strategic principles, especially accountability, transparency, and compliance. Super important. All right, let's look at a few pictures here. Okay, so we had, here we go, the virtual RIM manual and RIM team communications. So it's a way of getting in touch with the RIM team. They had what is the records management project. So very important, change management. They are really good at change management, I have to say. So got questions, we've got answers. So there's the contact stuff. Record resources, we'll take a look at that in a second. Laserfiche resources, so everything about the new upcoming EDRMS. The records classification and retention schedule, the newest and greatest version, sitting there easily accessible. And here's the resources, things like how are you handling your physical record storage, all the way down to classifying project files. So, this is just phenomenal. And then they had a place as well for the newsletters. So things like what's happening, what's advancing in records management in the City of Nanaimo. Very, very helpful sort of stuff. I got to say, I am not a change management expert. I'm not. I'm a consultant, so typically I get called up and I walk in and I go, oh, look, there's a hornet's nest in the corner. And I kick the hornet's nest and I go, yeah, those are hornets. This is how, if you want to fix them, give me a call, and I leave. So that's kind of the job that I do. So I really have a lot of admiration for folks who can manage change management. All right. Moving on to the final. Any questions? You can email me or text me, contact me through LinkedIn. I do have a YouTube channel that's going up. Information is poetry. Yeah, feel free to reach out. Thanks very much. I hope this made sense.